Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of AtScale's Data-Driven Podcast. And today's special guest is Justin Borgman. Justin is a chairman and CEO and founder of Starburst. Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dave. Great to be here.
Yeah, Justin, so listeners, Justin and I have known each other for a long time as fellow entrepreneurs in this new sort of big data space. So there's lots to talk about. So we're going to have a fun time reminiscing a little bit about just how we all got started, and then dive more deeply into what's happening in the realm of data. Lots of juicy topics here. But Justin, why don't you just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, about Starburst, your path into analytics. So how did you get to where you are today? Let's just start there.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously, Justin Borgman, co-founder and CEO of Starburst. For me, the journey in big data and analytics goes all the way back to early 2010. And back then, I was actually in grad school at the time and had just met a young professor at Yale. His name was Daniel Abadi. And Daniel, his PhD dissertation actually earlier became Vertica. So he had already had a big impact on the field, at a very young age, and had just become a professor at Yale. And one of the first papers that he and his researchers wrote was something called Hadoop DB. And the idea here was turning Hadoop into really a data warehouse. And I thought that was really interesting. I had come from a software engineering background. I was getting an MBA at the time, and I said, wow, you know what? I think this should be a business, in fact. I think this idea of doing SQL analytics in a data lake could be a big thing. And so we started our first company together, which became a company called Hadoop. I actually dropped out of school to do it and raised venture and built that business over 4 years. Ultimately selling it to Teradata in 2014. At Teradata, I became a VP and GM responsible for a portfolio of products that was really aimed at sort of figuring out the future of data warehousing analytics. So it was sort of like emerging technologies, if you will. And so Hadoop was part of that, or at least Teradata's approach to Hadoop was part of that. But it also gave me a lot of room to explore and really think about, ways that we could, really help Teradata solve their own innovator's dilemma. That classic Clayton Christensen, book. Teradata is sort of the poster child for a lot of that. And so, I tried to think about how we could disrupt ourselves. And that's really what led me to a different open source project created at Facebook that was at the time known as Presto. Today, it's more commonly known as Trino. But the idea was, this is a SQL engine, something that I already had a lot of experience with, but a SQL engine for everything. And that was really interesting to me, that you could query data in a variety of different data sources and really turn the data warehousing analytics model inside out. The model had always classically been about centralizing everything in one place. And this technology really allowed you to turn that inside out and allow you to query the data where it lives. So I started collaborating with the creators at Facebook. Even while I was at Teradata, we started to advance the project, add more enterprise capabilities to it. And my thought was, maybe this could be, a big business for Teradata itself and really, sort of change the direction of the company. I wasn't successful necessarily at changing the direction of Teradata, but ultimately in 2017, left Teradata and formed Starburst as the company behind this project. And the creators from Facebook left, Martine, Dane, and David, and joined me, and off we went. And so that was kind of the beginning. And of course, now we've raised over 400 million in venture capital. We're 600 people. A lot has changed in the last few years, but that's a little bit about, kind of how we got started, and, have spent, for better or worse, almost 15 years now in this space.
Yeah, let's just take that apart, because I always get questions from people about the sort of the entrepreneurial journey. And so, our backgrounds look very similar. So in terms of like how we sort of did it, it's like I started my first company called Mindshare. Yours was Adapt.
Yep.
and ended up not making a big success out of it, and selling it for a decent amount, but selling it to another company, and in that other company was really where it was a much bigger company, where we were able to was able to do more. But talk a little bit about just like you raised money twice on an idea. Starting with Adapt, you were still in school, right? And so you weren't a proven entrepreneur. I mean, because you were still, and you quit school, like you're like Zuckerberg, and Bill Gates. So you followed their footsteps. So what was it like to actually get that venture Adapt off the ground when you were still in school? How did you do that?
Yeah, and I will say, this is probably not what parents want to hear if anybody's listening, but for some reason, when you drop out of school, it actually adds street cred to you. So it like helps in the fundraising process that I had dropped out. But yeah, I mean, you're right. So first of all, as a first time entrepreneur, I think it is very hard, and I have tremendous respect for anybody who is going down that path, trying to get something off the ground. Because I think the secret that most people don't know is the vast majority fail before they even really get started. Unfortunately, this is a game where the odds are against you, and I think because of that, to me, one of the most important predictors of success is literally the will, the grit, the determination of the individual entrepreneur. Like, you have to be willing to have people say no 100 times to your face and keep going. And that persistence, can eventually pay off. So that was part of our story. I didn't probably know any better. That also helps, I think, when you're young. Just felt like this was the way the market was going to go. Hadoop was just starting to really gain momentum outside of Yahoo, which I know you obviously spent some time at Yahoo, and you were now starting to see other companies deploy it. Cloudera had been funded and it was, creating more popularity around the project. Hortonworks, came shortly after that. So there was momentum in the market, I think, around Hadoop broadly. And, we had a different approach. We were really thinking about it as a data warehouse, not just scalable storage or scalable batch processing, but like, could this actually be, a SQL data warehouse essentially? And through persistence and, probably some good luck along the way, we were able to, get some investors to believe in that. But initially it started with angel investors. So, our first round was finding angel investors actually local to the Connecticut, New Haven area where we were getting this thing started. Not necessarily a database hub, by the way, but that's where we were getting this off the ground. And, fortunately had a couple dozen people, individuals, believe in us, give us our first 1.5 million to go start to really move this thing forward. And then, from there, it was Bessemer and Norwest that led our Series A. And then shortly thereafter, actually brought Chris Lynch on the board, who you obviously know at AtScale. And he was a tremendous mentor to me as well. I think that's another piece of advice that I give entrepreneurs is like, find good mentors who can teach you and show you the ropes. And I was fortunate to have a few, but none bigger than Chris at that point.
Yeah. So listeners, Chris Lynch is the CEO of AtScale. So that it's definitely, the data community is definitely pretty incestuous and connected. And another example of that is, and I didn't know you from Adam, Justin, back when I was at Yahoo, and this was back in 2010. I don't even know how we got acquainted, but somehow we ended up, drinking beers and having dinner in Palo Alto, when you were forming Adapt at the time.
Yes, and funny enough, I remember in that conversation you were talking about OLAP cubes, and like you were trying to convince me to go in a slightly different direction, I think, at the time. And lo and behold, that basically became your company, shortly thereafter, which is really cool. So it is funny how all these things intersect, and you do find yourself running into a lot of the same people in this industry over and over.
But you said something that really rings true, is that you have to have the conviction because, for me personally, trying to fund AtScale, and get it off the ground, get that first, in my case, it was a seed round. It probably took almost a year to actually do that, and I got told no by just about everybody in the Valley, except for Ryan Floyd of Storm Ventures, who had the foresight to see that, yeah, that this was a new paradigm, and running analytics at scale, on a new sort of cloud-based infrastructure, or a new sort of distributed infrastructure, because we started with Hadoop as well, so we were of like minds there. Was going to be something where the market would move. But at the same time, right? I got into Yahoo through an acquisition, just like you got into Teradata through an acquisition, and so where our stories are also sort of overlap, not just on a time basis, but also just for me, at least personally, being part of Yahoo, which is my first big company where I was a part of, had challenges. It had challenges because there's a lot of people with jobs that I call them the talking heads, and very difficult to sort of break through the talking heads. And I was also surprised that that at that time Yahoo didn't really have a plan for what they wanted to do with that acquisition. And so you can go two different directions. You can say, well, I'm just going to just sit there and rest invest, like a lot of people do. Or you can do what you did and what I decided to do, which was like, hey, look, I got all these resources. I got all this big data. I got all these customers. Why don't I go and try to do something crazy and see where it goes? And it sounds like you had this similar experience at Teradata when you sort of like started to really peek behind the covers of Presto, and to see what you could do there.
Totally. And I actually think I totally resonate with what you just said in a way. And yes, you can take those two paths. And certainly, I know plenty of entrepreneurs that are like, big head in Silicon Valley on HBO and just, rest, invest on the roof and chill for a couple of years. But, if you sort of embrace it in a way, it's a tremendous opportunity to like take risks within the company itself. Like I think in a way that's what Teradata wanted me to do. There was a guy named Scott Now who was really the principal sponsor of our acquisition. He later actually became CTO of Hortonworks. But he just gave me latitude and the courage to sort of like go disrupt some stuff. And so that's what we tried to do while we were there. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, again, overlap again, Justin. Scott Now is also a very, very good friend of ours and a customer of AtScale, actually, at InterSystems. You do need that sort of somebody within a big company. I had Scott Kaufman was my guy, and so you need somebody sort of within the company who's really willing to take risks in the big company and give you the space to do that. And so that's where the idea for AtScale came about, because I tried to do big things, ran into many problems, trying to do those big things with big data, and saw a space where there was a gap in the market. And so really Yahoo gave me the ability to sort of test out some of those ideas at scale and take some risks. And so now we're both taking greater risks and starting our own companies, but that's the journey, I think, of an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and I'm curious if you feel the same, but doing it the second time around, like you're just so much wiser than the first. Would you agree with that? I mean, there's just so much learning in the job that I feel like the difference between me as a founder and CEO 10 years ago versus today is like almost two different people.
Yeah, there is no substitute for experience, but there is like, and in raising money, especially at my age, you're young, so you have no trouble with this. But there's two sides to that coin, Justin, and especially in the venture industry, older entrepreneurs are really frowned upon, and they're frowned upon because, if you think about it, as we get older in life, I know you just had another kid. Yeah. You got that mortgage, you got the family, and the idea is that you're going to take less risks as a result. is that because you can't afford to take those risks. Whereas if you're straight out of school, like you were when you started Adapt, is that basically all you got is an apartment, no mortgage, sky's the limit, no, probably no girlfriend, or
Yeah.
boyfriend, whatever, so you can work all hours of the day. And that's true in a large degree. That's very true. You have more energy and more time to put towards a venture. But like you said, it's like without that experience, without that gray hair and seeing it, you're going to make first time mistakes during that first time, the first time at your new venture. And sometimes those mistakes, actually most of the time, those mistakes can be fatal to the company. So I think there's a lot to be said for having some experience. And I don't believe that because you're older, you lack energy or lack the willingness to take risks.
Yep.
Anyway, that's awesome. Is there any other sort of before we sort of move on to sort of more of the technical stuff that we're doing, Justin? Is there anything else advice you would give for an entrepreneur, either somebody who's in it or somebody who's thinking about potentially wanting to start a company of their own?
Yeah, I'll give a piece of advice that I also give to entrepreneurs. It's sometimes considered controversial, so maybe that'll be interesting for the viewers, although I don't find it to be particularly controversial, which is that I strongly recommend aspiring entrepreneurs quit whatever they're doing and pour themselves entirely into the idea of what they're trying to build, rather than doing both at the same time. I meet a lot of people that are trying to hedge that risk by working their 9-to-5 job or whatever their job is to keep that income going and then get this thing going on the side. And I just think startups are too hard to be a hobby, too hard to be a side hustle. And the other thing related to that is I very much believe that the survival instinct that we have as animals here is a really important motivator when you're building that business. I think fear is a very healthy thing. And once you've kind of really traded something off, you're very aware of the sacrifice that you've made, and that sort of, to me, can be an even more powerful driver. In a very simplistic way, for me, leaving school, which my mom thought was a terrible idea, of course, was like, holy crap, I better not screw this up. I can't have this be a really bad decision. I can't, go back, with my tail between my legs. I've got to make this successful. And so that was always a driver that, got me up early and got me, working as hard as I possibly could. And so I think when you've got that comfortable job at the same time, it's very hard to do both. So that's my, sometimes controversial piece of advice.
Yeah, it's working without a net, isn't it? So I'll second that advice. I left Clout to start AtScale, and I was unemployed for a year as I wrote the business plan and developed the prototype, and then went on the fundraising march. And that just could not have been a part-time job. It's just not possible, like you said.
Yeah.
So I think that's fantastic advice. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about the state of analytics and data. Starburst is you hit the scene with a vengeance. I mean, it's a pretty amazing how you were able to co-opt what was happening really at Facebook, where Presto was invented, sort of incubate and build out a real business, within Teradata, and then start Starburst, with a bang. And so how do you see customers and your customers using Starburst, and what's changed, Justin, in terms of how they use Starburst versus how they traditionally have run analytics against databases and data warehouses and so forth?
So I think there are two things that I would credit towards why our value proposition seems to resonate with customers. I think number one, I do believe there is a resurgence in interest in data lakes as a large center of gravity for your data. And when I say resurgence, I mean, again, if we go back a little over a decade, of course, Hadoop was the first data lake that was synonymous with the data lake, I think a lot of the principles of Hadoop live on today, even though Hadoop, is significantly less popular. We could talk about why that is, but a lot of the concepts live on. The idea of open data formats, the idea of low-cost commodity storage, the idea of something incredibly scalable. And in the cloud era, I think you are seeing more and more companies, customers, use data lakes as a huge foundational element of their data strategy. And Starburst and Trino and Presto, are is a world-class SQL engine for that. So if you want to do data warehousing analytics within your data lake, we're a great solution. And that's really, again, why Facebook built it. Airbnb, Netflix, LinkedIn, a lot of the hyperscalers leverage our technology for those types of use cases. So that's one piece of it. The second piece, and this is what really drew me to it while I was at Teradata, was that it recognizes a practical reality, which is that you're not going to have everything in one place. You're going to have data in multiple data sources, and every large company has this phenomenon. And that became really apparent to me when I was at Teradata, because despite them being the industry leader in the enterprise data warehouse, this idea of like really bringing all of your data into one data warehouse, not one of their customers actually did that. Every single customer had data that lived outside of Teradata. And that got me to think that, that model is actually impossible. I don't actually think you can create a singular monolithic enterprise data warehouse that has all of your data if you're beyond, a significant size. Maybe a small little startup can do that, but when you're a larger company, that's just impossible. And so the idea of being able to federate and query across multiple data sources, extend beyond that data lake, was a big differentiator as well. And that's really, I think, what helped us, get going. And, in the early 2 years, we were actually bootstrapped. We didn't raise venture right away, which was also a fun way to get a business off the ground. Really just working with existing users of the open source project and converting them into customers. And then from there, starting to really scale the business.
Yeah, that was sweet. That was so, man, that's a dream to start a business without having to raise capital. And so you started the business making money. That's amazing. I want to go back to what you said here a little bit about Hadoop, because, we both got started in Hadoop. We both sort of bet a lot on Hadoop, obviously. And obviously, Hadoop is seen as a big failure. So talk a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind. It's like, because and then I'll contrast it to because it was the first data lake, and data lakes. I'm completely with you that a data lake is a great pattern, especially if you can add engines on top of it to do the work that you need to do. So if you have data in a common format, you can add the engine, whether it's an engine for data science or analytics. Like you have with Starburst, wide load it and reformat and copy data and store it in a proprietary format to do a particular job. If you don't have to do that, that's wonderful, right? Not having to copy data. So that all makes sense. And Hadoop, that was like one of the fundamental ideas about a Hadoop, was to be able to store data in common formats, and be able to allow different operators on that data. So in your opinion, Justin, why did it fail?
Yeah, I attribute it to a couple of things, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this too, since I'm sure you've reflected a lot on it over the past decade as well. To me, one of the big issues was that I think the hype preceded the reality to some degree. Like it was such a big deal in that period of time. Again, 2010, 11, 12. And so much capital raised by the principal Hadoop vendors. Cloudera had raised over $1 billion, which back then was utterly unheard of. Today there are some companies that raise $1 billion, but back then nobody did that. That was record breaking. And then Hortonworks was chasing them. And through all of that, I think that they oversold, in my opinion, what Hadoop could do. Even though our vision was to make it the data warehouse of the future, and they came around to that vision and introduced actually a competing product to us, so we would agree on the long-term vision. I think they oversold where it was on day one, and so you ended up with a lot of customers that felt like it didn't live up to the promise. Like, who would deploy Hadoop, start to throw stuff into it, say, oh, cool, I can get rid of Teradata, run SQL queries on Hadoop. And they weren't getting the performance that they needed. They weren't able to do updates and deletes of their data. And so it was like, this really immature, version of what people thought it could be. And so I think it left a lot of bad taste in people's mouths by not living up to that promise. And there was an analyst who covered the database space for a long time named Kurt Monash, who I remember, one of his posts, he said it takes like 6 years to build a database. And I think that's right. It takes a really long time to build a real functional database. And, the query engines at that time, including Adapt, just hadn't had enough years behind it to really mature that. And so, again, I think it was like kind of ahead of its time and promised too much too early, too soon. And I think actually all those venture capital dollars are probably part of the reason why, right? If you raise $1 billion, you've got to make this thing big fast. And I think that led, some of those folks to be a little bit too aggressive. The other issue to me is that, and I hope I'm not offending any Cloudera alumni in the audience here, but I think despite their name, they missed the cloud era. And that was a huge miss.
Yes.
Because the entire industry was moving in that direction and they just weren't playing there. I mean, they've been so late to that game. So.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you on what you said. It's for us, our first sort of data platform that the semantic layer talked to was Hadoop, and we sold our first dozen customers on Hadoop, and it became pretty apparent really fast that our customers were just struggling for making Hadoop work, and for AtScale that was an existential crisis because we relied on the data platform to do the work, to do that last mile when it came to data. And so we couldn't be successful if Hadoop wasn't successful. And what I saw was that, Hadoop made the mistake, and the vendors in Hadoop, they made the mistake of sort of like trying to do too much, and doing too much poorly, right? Yep. So it's like it's an inch deep and a mile wide. Yep. And so nothing really worked well, right? It's like yes, it could do job management, but it really didn't do it well at all. It's like, yes, you had a SQL interface, but it didn't work really well at all. And so instead of sort of focusing on a few use cases and making those work really well, they kept on adding more and more features and more versions of packages. And then, the big Hadoop vendors end up just being basically packagers. And they were just packaging open source and not really adding any value on top of it. So ultimately, I think customers are like you said with the cloud. It's like Home Depot is not in the business of operating their own data platform. Right. They're in the business to sell products for home improvement. And so what I saw is that customers experimented, it wasn't successful. And then when the cloud was ready for them, they saw the cloud as a way out of letting somebody else manage that for them and them getting back to business. But the ideas, like you said, of the data lake are, I think, really starting to be realized finally. Yeah. What's that? It's almost 15 years later.
Right. Yeah, totally. 100% agree. And I think you made a good point in there too for any aspiring entrepreneurs, which is don't try to do everything. Like, focus on being the best at one thing, and I think just as a startup, you don't have enough resources, even if you do raise $1 billion, to do everything incredibly well. So I think there's a lesson there too.
Definitely a lesson there. So hey, Justin, when it comes to sort of how you're seeing customers deploy Starburst, or just what you're seeing in the market in general, there's this whole idea of decentralizing analytics, where, we were born, I was born of the era where everything was done by a central data team, and the central data team did everything, data pipelines. They also, produced, the BI platforms of the days, the business objects and the like. They built those cubes. They may have even built the dashboards and the reports for the business. And, and then we saw the Tableau come on the scene and just blow that up so that the business was doing everything themselves. And now we're sort of like, I don't know, maybe somewhere in the middle, but people talk about data mesh. Yep. I like to talk about it as hub and spoke. What are you seeing out there with this sort of new trend?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, but I also, before I share some comments, I will caution, the audience that like any trend, these things do not happen from 0 to 1 overnight, right? And so don't expect that everybody deploys a data mesh tomorrow. I don't think that's what will happen here. I think instead it's more evolutionary, and I think it depends on the organization in terms of whether it makes sense for you. I think central teams will always play an important role for things that logically should be centralized, governance and things of that nature. But what data mesh really represents, I think, is an acknowledgement that data is inherently decentralized in large organizations, and how to really turn that into a strength. Like, how can we empower the data domain owners, the people who know the data the best, to play a more active role in, data management? And how do we think about treating data as a first-class product that we make available in this organization? And I think a lot of those concepts are very interesting. The notion of hub and spoke, I like that term. That's actually what we use when we're training our sales reps, as a matter of fact, because they're both important. And I think you have to be aware of that, right? Like, central data teams will play a really important role, but you also have to get buy-in from the spokes. And I think it's that collaboration between those two that creates, success for customers and hopefully success for vendors as well, that can help facilitate that.
Yeah, me being in when I was at Yahoo and running analytics, it was like there's just no way I could have a team understand every segment of our business. Yep. In our case, it was advertising and our audience. It's like, look, it's like the business understands their problem and what they need to solve their problem, and the kind of data they need to solve the problem. So if we can enable them, that's fantastic. But you can't just you can't just turn them into IT people. That's not what they want, and it's not their job either. So you got to have some kind of help and standards. And so I do like the hub and spoke. I use the same thing when talking about just how you decentralize and leverage more people in the organization to do analytics. Yeah. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about costs. There's this whole idea. FinOps is a new term that's sort of being talked about a lot, because people have moved from on-prem, where we went from sort of a CapEx, right, and into the cloud, where now it's OpEx. Yep. And now in your OpEx, everything matters. So what are you seeing with your customers? What are you seeing in the market in terms of how people are dealing with this sort of new paradigm where, they're running analytics in OpEx without CapEx or instead of CapEx?
Yeah, I think it's important, and probably particularly important right now with some macroeconomic uncertainty. Will there be a recession? People are more focused on those operating costs than they have been maybe for the past couple of years. And, simultaneously, people are recognizing that consumption models, well, I think there are a ton of benefits to consumption models, and we generally sell as a consumption model as well. You have to keep an eye on them, right? Or they can get out of control. And there's an element of this that is, to me, also replaying history. Like, I think if we go back, 40 years of database history, with the early advent of the enterprise data warehouse model, you would consolidate data in one place. Maybe that was Teradata, my former employer. But in the process, you're locking your data into the hands of one single vendor, and those costs generally start to increase, and you feel locked in. It's very hard to sort of get out of those situations where you put your most valuable data in the hands of one vendor in a proprietary data format. So I think that movie, which led to some resentment towards Teradata, Oracle, some of those vendors, is now replaying itself in the cloud world, with Snowflake being the best example of that. Obviously, the most successful cloud data warehouse today. But that success also comes with spiraling costs for customers, at least those that have achieved some level of scale. And so I think customers now are starting to think about how do they rationalize that spend? How do they manage that spend? And really, does all data need to fly first class in an expensive cloud data warehouse? Or does some of that data work in a data lake? Again, it's kind of back to a lot of those concepts of, 15 years ago where it was Teradata and Hadoop. Well, maybe now I should have Snowflake and an S3 data lake, and I should use Iceberg or something as a data format, which is open source, and I can use multiple engines to query it. So I think that's what you're seeing. And I think that's also what's driving some of the increased attention in data lake models now as well.
Yeah, it's like, do you really need that query every hour or every minute, or can you get it once a day? I mean, it's like, you have to start asking yourselves those questions because, it costs money for lower latency. It costs money for, to fly first class. I like that. I like your analogy. That's an awesome way of thinking about it. Okay, so let's just close it out. I've had you for way too long, but for something that's a little more fun. There's a lot of talk about GBT and how and large language models and how that might affect analytics.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on that, Justin?
I think tremendous future. Like I'm very bullish on the potential. But I think we're in like the earliest innings, right? Like right now, I'm sure this is the case in your company as well. Like, engineers are playing with these tools to write poems, about, or ballads or epic stories, about, random things. Like people are having fun with it, right? It's sort of almost like a gimmick or a curiosity. But I think that undermines its potential, which to me, especially in the world of data, is pretty interesting. Like if you could automatically craft valuable data products that your business users need and can get value from, that's hugely powerful. I think it potentially could play some disruptive role in the BI landscape to some degree as well. So I think there's a lot of potential, but we're just barely scratching the surface. And I think there are likely going to be, if not already, a number of interesting, I think, startups that will be founded around, how you leverage generative AI to help facilitate or automate, elements of analytics going forward.
I like it. Well, let's hope those startups don't raise too much money, Justin, and try to do too much.
That's right.
Well, hey, Justin, it was great hanging out with you. You have a great background, and you've built a large company, on a shoestring. So you're a role model for a lot of people out there who are looking to build their own businesses. So I want to thank you for hanging out with me today.
Thank you.
And thanks all the listeners for hanging out with us. So thanks, everybody.
Take care.